Music.
Three jolly rogues came in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a pint of Guinness, boys, before we take our leave. Yes, a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues came in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a glass of wine, me boys, before we take our leave. A glass of wine and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a having a whiskey, boys, before we take our leave. A having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. Have a mug of ale, me boys, before we take our leave. A mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. Have a dram of scotch, boys, before we take our leave. A dram of scotch, a mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a tar and beating, boys, before we take our leave. A tot of rum, a dram of scotch, a mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Jolly rogues up in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a dram of punch, boys, before we take our leave. A jog of punch, a tot of rum, a dram of scotch, a mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Jolly rogues come in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a jar of mead, me boys, before we take our leave. A jar of mead, a jog of punch, a tot of rum, a dram of scotch, a mug of ale, having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a jigger of gin, boys, before we take our leave. A jigger of gin, a jar of mead, a jog of punch, a tot of rum, a dram of scotch, a mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Three jolly rogues step in the pub along the summer's eve. We'll have a cigarette brandy, boys, before we take our leave. A cigarette brandy, jar of mead, a jog of punch, a tot of rum, a dram of scotch, a mug of ale, a having a whiskey, a glass of wine, and a pint of Guinness before we take our leave. Yes, a pint of Guinness before we take our leave.